This concept needs no introduction. We've heard it a million times in school, and we usually just think of it as background info. That understanding is child's play. In this lesson, you're going to get the big boy version.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Here are all the times context has appeared in a past WACE exam question between 2016 and 2022. 2016, 2016, 2017, 2017, 2017, 2019, 2020, 21, 2022. So, every single WACE exam except for 2018. Also, you might have noticed from these 2 slides of past WACE exam questions that context has only appeared in the responding section. That is a pretty valuable insight. Syllabus points, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 40 syllabus points. Context appears in 1/8 of them. Lesson objectives. Firstly, we will define context. Then we'll outline 2 categories of context, the 2 categories. Then we will explain context of production and context of reception, explain context of culture and context of situation. From there, we'll discuss the interplay between the categories of context. We'll explain an example, analyze a past WACE exam question, highlight some context tips, and then outline a simple summary. Starting with definition of context. Okay, this definition from the Scarza glossary has 3 sentences. We're just going to focus on the first 2. The environment in which a text is responded to or created. Context can include the general social, historical, and cultural conditions in which a text is responded to and created, the context of culture, or the specific features of its immediate environment, context of situation. And the third sentence, the term is also used to refer to the wording surrounding an unfamiliar word that a reader or listener uses to understand its meaning. These are the 2 sentences we're going to focus on. You can ignore that last one. The first 2 sentences reveal the 2 categories of context that you need to be aware of in order to properly answer a question about context. Before we turn to those categories, let's check out the English ATAR made simple overarching definition of context. The definition is the cultural and situational environment in which a text is created or responded to. The rest of this lesson will clarify what these elements within the definition mean. Everything that we're really going to be discussing in this lesson falls within one of the concepts or elements that you see in this definition. So I'd like you to bear that in mind as we go through this lesson to tie back certain elements that we're about to learn about to this definition. But first, a key takeaway, that being context is not a feature or technique such as a rhetorical question or a metaphor that text creators use. Rather, context exists around text creators and audiences, hence the use of the word environment in our definition. Speaking of environment, what does this word actually mean? It's going to come up a lot in this lesson, and it is absolutely pivotal to your understanding of context. I'll mention this a lot, but from now on, when you hear the word context, I want you to immediately associate it with the word environment. So environment means the world in which we live and how it influences us. One more time, if you're going to come away with one thing at the end of this lesson, it's that context equals environment. A nice and simple way to illustrate this point about the environment is the classic story of Isaac Newton, an apple, and gravity. This is Newton sitting beneath an apple tree holding a text. In this scenario, the apple represents the environment, aka the context. The text creator is Newton, and the text is Newton's magnum opus, the Principia Mathematica. This text, the Principia, revolutionized the way we understand motion and gravity. Just to make sure we're on the same page, what happened in this scenario is that Newton was sitting beneath this tree, he was contemplating motion and gravity, he had an apple fall on his head, and at that moment he had an epiphany, a breakthrough in understanding gravity. This particular breakthrough was instrumental in Newton producing the Principia, which has become one of the most influential books in physics ever. The main point in this example is that it was only through Newton's environment, the apple falling on his head, that he was ultimately able to have these epiphanies about gravity and motion that he could then produce in the text, the Principia. In short, Newton's context, Newton's environment was everything in this breakthrough. Without the environment, without his context, arguably we would not have the same understanding of motion and gravity that we do today, or at the very least, it might not have come from Newton. Newton's context influenced his production of this text, the Principia. And that leads us to the two categories of context. Our first one, context of production and context of reception. Our second category is context of culture and context of situation. Starting with context of production and context of reception, in short, COP and COR. This first category of context manifests in the first sentence of the Scarza definition of context, the environment in which a text is responded to or created. These words responded and created each represent a different type of context. And these two types make up our first category of context. This makes a bit more sense if we return to our overarching definition of context. The cultural and situational environment in which a text is created or responded to. The word created refers to the first type of context in this category, context of production, and the word or the words responded to refers to the second type of context in this category, context of reception. The question arises naturally, what is the fundamental difference between context of production and context of reception? In short, context of production is the creator's environment, and context of reception is the audience's environment. This will come up as we go through this lesson, but I just want to flag it at the outset because it's the way that I can easily understand the difference between these two types of context within this first category of context. And that is, the word created is really just a synonym for the word production. Creation, production basically mean the same thing. So that's how we go from created here to context of production here. On the other hand, if you're responding to something, you need to receive something. Think of it as though you're receiving a text, and a version of the word receive is the word reception, context of reception. So if you are creating a text, you're dealing with the context of production. If you are receiving a text, watching it, reading it, viewing it, whatever, you're dealing with the context of reception. Let's take a look at each of these two types in a bit more depth. Starting with context of production. It's creator focused, and our definition for this is the environment in which a text is created. This is getting at what I mentioned a moment ago. It's useful to note that the word production in this type of context of production, is basically synonymous with the word creation. In other words, the definition here could well be the environment in which a text is produced. I don't know why it's called context of production instead of context of creation. Maybe because the acronym for the former is a bit more appropriate than the acronym for the latter, but I'm not sure. Anyway, let's take a look at an example. The text that we'll be referring to is Ex Machina, another one of my favorites. The link to the trailer for Ex Machina is in the resources tab below the video. Go give it a watch if you'd like some context for this analysis, pardon the pun, and come back once you're done. Hopefully you enjoyed the trailer. It is an awesome movie, another one that I would highly recommend. The director of the movie, his name is Alex Garland. And when we're looking at context of production, we know it's creator focused, so we're focusing, in the case of a movie, on the context relating to the director. The things that happened in the director's life that influenced their production, their creation of the movie. Those factors are the environment that influenced Garland's production of Ex Machina. One of the important factors for Garland that influenced his production of Ex Machina was the fact that when he was 11 years old, his parents bought him his first computer on which he started to do some basic coding. As Garland was doing some coding on this computer, he started to think that the computer had its own mind. Garland later in life had several discussions with a friend who had expertise in neuroscience, who claimed that machines could never be sentient, which means able to perceive and feel things. Later on, Garland had an epiphany for the idea of Ex Machina while reading a book about consciousness and embodiment. Then, during the 2000s and early 2010s, leading up to the film's release, technology advanced exponentially, so much so that the idea of artificial intelligence was no longer strictly a matter of science fiction. Now, these circumstances can all be regarded as the environment in which Ex Machina, the text, was produced. All of these circumstances can be regarded as the creator's context. Before we turn to the context of reception, I'd like to mention the influence of purpose on the context of production. Why mention purpose? As we'll see briefly in the next lesson and thoroughly in Module 5, context, purpose, and audience go hand in hand. So this segment is a little teaser for those discussions that we'll have later on. In short, the purpose of a text is significantly influenced by the environment in which the text is created. Let's discuss two scenarios to make sense of this. Scenario 1. Returning to our example of the movie Ex Machina, one purpose of the text could be to encourage the audience to consider whether machines could become sentient, which basically just means AI. Let's assume that's what the main purpose of the film is, according to its director, Alex Garland, and bearing in mind that it came out in 2014. ChatGPT was not a thing. The question of whether machines can be sentient, remember, feeling and perceiving things, was and continues to be quite topical in our society. Now let's turn to scenario 2. Fast forward 100 years into the future. It's the 22nd century and there are sentient machines living among us. How relevant would the purpose of Ex Machina be in the 22nd century? Remember, the purpose is interrogating this question of whether machines can be sentient. If in the 22nd century, that question is already answered because sentient machines are living among us, the purpose of it isn't that interesting. But interrogating that question at the beginning of the 21st century, as Alex Garland did in 2014, it's much more interesting because we don't have the answer to it. So here we see that the environment in which the text is created is influencing the purpose of the text. So that's the first type of context in the first category of context. Let's turn to the second type, context of reception. As you'll recall, context of reception shifts from creator focus to an audience focus. Context of production, creator focused. Context of reception, audience focused. Our definition for the context of reception is the environment in which a text is responded to. Before we move on, I'm going to reiterate what this word reception means. Without going into too much depth with the definition, I think the easiest way to understand the word reception is to compare it with the word receive. If we receive a text, we're basically reading it or viewing it. In other words, we're responding to it. Hence the words responded to in the definition. We're going to touch on the influence of purpose on the context of reception at the outset. The main point is that the purpose of a text is significantly influenced by the environment in which a text is received. We've got a couple of scenarios to make more sense of this sentence. Scenario 1. Let's pretend that you watched the movie Ex Machina with a mate during the 2023 summer holidays in your lounge room. You both watched the movie for the purpose of entertainment, and it certainly served that purpose because you both loved it. Fast forward to the present day, and it just so happens that Ex Machina is a text that you're studying in English ATAR. This time, instead of watching it for the purpose of entertainment, you're watching it for the purpose of analyzing how it conforms to and challenges the conventions of the sci-fi genre. What we're seeing here is that in both scenarios, the environment is influencing the purpose for which we're watching the movie. The lounge room environment is influencing the purpose of entertainment. The classroom environment is influencing, molding, creating the purpose of analyzing it. Bearing all of that in mind, the context of reception, i.e. the way you perceived the text, would differ between both viewings. Some factors you could mention regarding the context of reception for scenario 1 include you watched the movie for entertainment with a friend during the school holidays. You weren't stressed about school, and you went to the beach before watching the movie. Those circumstances equal the environment in which the text was received and in turn probably made you enjoy the movie quite a bit. What about some factors for scenario 2? They include you watched and studied the movie during semester 2 of year 12. You were stressed about exams and your ATAR score, and you wish you're at the beach instead of analysing the movie in agonising detail. All of those circumstances equal the environment in which the text was received, and in turn probably changed the way you felt about the movie for the worse. Now, you can't watch the movie without getting PTSD about how certain camera angles and camera shots were used for certain reasons. I know exactly how that feels. That's the first category of context out of the way. Now onto the second category and the final one, which is context of culture and context of situation. This second category manifests in the second sentence of the SCASA glossary definition. That is, context can include the general social, historical, and cultural conditions in which a text is responded to and created, context of culture, or the specific features of its immediate environment, context of situation. That sentence tells us pretty clearly that the two types of context that fall into this second category of context are context of culture and context of situation. We can also see those in our overarching definition of context: cultural, situational. The word cultural is referring to the context of culture, and the word situational refers to context of situation. Hopefully you're starting to understand what I mentioned at the beginning of the lesson, where our definition of context and all the elements within it really form the basis of everything you need to know about context. If you understand context of production, context of reception, context of culture, context of situation, your understanding of context will be far greater than most year 12s, at least 90%. By the way, another term for the context of culture is cultural context, and another term for the context of situation is situational context. Before we move on, the fundamental difference between cultural context and situational context is that cultural context is broad, general, and situational context is specific. For example, Australian culture is much broader, much more general than my specific situation right now. My specific situation right now is that I am in my room filming this lesson. Let's chat about the cultural context first. Our definition for this one is the general features surrounding a text's production and reception. And those general features refer to geographic features, religious features, ideological features, political features, socio-cultural features, and historical features. An acronym for the 6 features is GRIPS-H or GRIPSH. Let's discuss each one in a bit more detail, starting with geographic features. The question to ask for this one is, has geographical location influenced the text? For example, Harper Lee's To Kill a Mockingbird explores the entrenchment of racial inequality in the Deep South of the US, which comprises several states that were heavily dependent on plantations and slavery throughout the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Note that geographical features are closely related to socio-cultural features, which are coming a bit later. But for now, our next feature is religious features. The question to ask for this is, has a particular religion or religious belief influenced the text? For example, the portrayal of Aslan as a messianic figure in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Generally speaking, religion played a much more important role around the time the text was published, 1950, than it does today. Ideological features. Question to ask, does a prevailing ideology influence the text? For example, the prevalence of feminism in the US in the 1980s influenced the plot of The Handmaid's Tale, where women's rights are severely limited. Side note, ideology is a system of beliefs or ideas held by a group of people. Political features. Our questions to ask are, have any policies influenced the text? Has the conflict between particular political parties influenced the text? Example is the influence of various homophobic policies in 1970s San Francisco on the movie Milk. The movie tells the story of Harvey Milk, an American activist who became California's first openly gay elected official. Some notes: a policy is a course of action adopted by a government, and politics refers to the activities associated with the governance of a country and the parties who fight to be in power. Sociocultural features. The question to ask is, have any significant sociocultural movements and/or events influence the text? Example: Tim Winton's short story Neighbours explores the sociocultural conditions of Australia in the late 20th century. In the short story, a young Australian couple move into a neighbourhood full of, quote, European migrants. The text initially depicts a clash of cultures, but eventually highlights that multiple cultures within one society can complement one another and enhance the overall quality of life. Lastly, historical features. The question to ask: have any historical events influenced the text? Example: the plot of Fahrenheit 451 involves rampant book burning. The book was published in 1953, which was 8 years after World War II ended and the defeat of Nazism. 20 years prior, in 1933, the German Student Union burned over 25,000 books that were viewed as subversive to the Nazi regime. That is context of culture. Now we're going to context of situation, which is the second type in the second category of context. Our definition for the context of situation is the specific features surrounding a text's production and reception. As I said earlier, context of culture refers to the general features, context of situation refers to the specific features. So, what are those specific features? Well, we have personal context, immediate events, and time, place, and medium, or PIT for short. Turning to personal context first, questions to ask: how has the personal context of the audience, i.e. you, influenced the reception of the text? And the other one: how has the text creator's personal context influenced the text's production? Examples: your fascination with technology prompted you to watch Ex Machina. That example relates to this question, the personal context of the audience. This next example relates to this question, the text creator's personal context. Alex Garland, remember the director of Ex Machina, had several discussions with a friend who had expertise in neuroscience who claimed that machines could never be sentient. Note: I've listed a bunch of factors that might be relevant to the text creators and audience's personal context in the PDF study notes. Go give them a quick skim now. Come back once you're done. So that's the P in PIT, the personal context. Now let's look at immediate events. Question to ask: did anything significant, influential happen around the production and reception of the text? Example: Fight Club's theatrical release in 1999 was delayed in light of the Columbine High School massacre shooting in April and the mayhem, pun intended, caused by the festival goers of Woodstock 99 in July. Those significant, influential events around the production or release of the film influenced it. Finally, the T in PIT, time, place, and medium. The questions to ask are: when was the text produced and received? Which refers to the time. Where was the text produced and received? Refers to the place. And how was the text produced and received? And that refers to the medium. Example: Batman. Not the Batman with Robert Pattinson, but the one with Michael Keaton, the kind of original Batman. It was produced and released in 1989. That refers to the time. It was shot at Pinewood Studios in England from October 10, 1998 to February 14, 1989. That refers to the place. And it had a theatrical release in Los Angeles in June 1989, and it was distributed to theaters internally in subsequent months after that, and that refers to the medium. Also, note the following excerpt from the movie's Wikipedia page. In the months before Batman's release in June 1989, a popular culture phenomenon known as Batmania began. Over $750 million worth of merchandise was sold. Cult filmmaker and comic book writer Kevin Smith remembered, "That summer was huge. You couldn't turn around without seeing the bat signal somewhere. People were cutting it into their fucking heads. It was just the summer of Batman, and if you were a comic book fan, it was pretty hot. Why bring that up with reference to Medium? Because in that example, the marketing of the bat signal was a medium of communication. It communicated information about the movie. A final thing to discuss before turning to how all of these puzzle pieces fit together is how cultural context and situational context relate to one another. I think the difference between context of production and context of reception is fairly easy because the first one, context of production, is creator focused, and the second one, context of reception, is audience focused. But the difference between these two types of context is a little bit murkier. In light of that, we can think of the context of culture as requiring us to analyze a text with a satellite. So we can see all the general things happening in the world and how they might influence the text's production and reception. On the other hand, we can think of context as situation as requiring us to analyze the text with a microscope. So we can see all the little things happening in the text's immediate environment and how they influence the text's production and reception. All of that is to say, cultural context influences situational context. For instance, an ideological conflict between two countries, which refers to a general feature, an ideological feature, influences the way in which a text creator who is born in one of those countries depicts said conflict. And that refers to a specific feature, personal context. Moving on to our second last main section of this lesson, the interplay between the categories of context. How does everything we have just discussed fit together in a nice little puzzle? Here's a diagram that really helps me understand how all the pieces fit together, and you've got this whole diagram on one page in the PDF study notes. Firstly, ask yourself, does the question ask for the text context or your context? I've listed past exam questions that ask for the text context in the PDF study notes if you'd like to see how this plays out in assessments. So if the question asks for the text context, it's referring to the context of production. And embedded in the context of production is cultural context. And as we know, cultural context influences situational context. The same line of reasoning applies if the question asks for your context. As with the text context, I've included all the relevant past WACE exam questions that do ask for your context. So if the question asks for your context, it's referring to the context of reception because you receive the text. You watch it, read it, view it. And embedded in the context of reception is cultural context, and as we know, cultural context influences situational context. If you understand the interrelation between these categories of context and these types of context, as I mentioned earlier in this lesson, you have a better understanding of context than 90% of people doing English ATAR. At this point, it's a really good idea to just try and soak up, absorb what this diagram is saying. So I encourage you to pause the video now, look at the diagram in the PDF study notes, and just make sure you understand the why. Why does text context lead to context of production? And then why is cultural context outside? And then why is situational context inside? And then the same over on this side. If you can understand this flowchart, the rest of context is easy. Let's check out an example. Our example text is the interview. As usual, there is a link to the trailer in the resources tab below this video. Give it a watch so you can get a gist for what this text is about. Come back once you're done. As we discuss this text, I'd just like you to listen to the sort of things you could say about each feature in relation to a text that you're studying. No need to take notes. Turning to context of production and the relevant cultural context first, starting with geographic features. The demilitarized zone separating North Korea and South Korea remains one of the most heavily fortified borders in the world. Also, the northern and southern states of the US have historically clashed based on ideological differences. That was the Civil War in a nutshell, not Captain America Civil War. Also, citizens of North Korea are denied freedom of movement. They cannot leave the country. Religious features: North Korea is an atheist state. According to Human Rights Watch, religions are restricted by the government. Also, North Korea is allegedly responsible for the most severe persecution of Christians in the world. And then 70% of the US is Christian. Ideological features: we have socialism, which is North Korea, versus capitalism, the USA. Political features: North Korea is a totalitarian dictatorship, and then USA is a democracy. Socio-cultural features: the 2014 UN inquiry into the abuses of human rights in North Korea concluded that the gravity, scale, and nature of these violations reveal a state that does not have any parallel in the contemporary world. Essentially, every single aspect of a person's life in North Korea is controlled. And finally, historical features: the Korean War began in 1950 when North Korea invaded South Korea. It lasted 3 years. An armistice brought about a ceasefire and established a demilitarized zone, but no formal treaty was ever signed. And in the Korean War, the US supported South Korea. Those are some general features of the cultural context of production. What about the context of situation? The film was co-produced and directed by Evan Goldberg and Seth Rogen. The Interview was their second directorial work, following the release of This Is the End, which came out 1 year prior in 2013. Goldberg and Rogen developed the idea for the script in the late 2000s. Immediate events. This is where it gets juicy. In June 2014, the North Korean government threatened action against the United States if Sony released the film. This actually led Sony to delay the release of the film from October to December so they could re-edit the film to make it more acceptable to the North Korean government. It gets better. In November 2014, Sony was hacked by Guardians of the Peace, who are a North Korean cybercrime group. The Guardians of the Peace threatened terrorist attacks against theaters that showed the film. As a result, many major movie chains decided not to release the film, which then led Sony to release it online for digital rental on Christmas Day of 2014. Time, place, and medium. The movie was announced in March 2013 and then it was released in 2014. That's the time. It was filmed in Vancouver from October to December of 2014. That's the place. As we know, it was initially planned for a theatrical release, but it was eventually just released online for streaming in 2014, and that is the medium. Those are some specific features of the situational context of production. Let's shift from context of production to context of reception, and from context of situation to context of culture. These are general features. Remember that context of production is creator-focused, whereas context of reception is audience-focused. Because we're looking at context of reception now, we've shifted to this one, and we're not talking about context of production anymore. Now we're looking at really my context, the environment in which I watched the film. Geographic features: Australia is an island continent. Religious feature: over 50% of the population is Christian. Ideological feature: capitalism. Political feature: democracy. Socio-cultural feature: Australians have some of the highest living standards in the world. Historical feature: Australia supported South Korea in the Korean War. They supported South Korea against the North Korean invasion. Those are some general features of cultural context that influenced, whether subconsciously or consciously, my reception of the film. Finally, the context of situation, situational context. Starting with personal context. Firstly, I was in year 11 when the movie came out. I really enjoyed movies with Seth Rogen and James Franco, and I'm a huge fan of This Is the End and Pineapple Express. Not too sure about Franco these days. Anyway, immediate events. I had just finished year 11 and I was aware of all the controversy surrounding the film. Naturally, all of this controversy created quite a bit of hype and anticipation. And I watched this movie during the summer holidays right before starting year 12. Because I was in holiday mode, it almost made watching the movie more enjoyable. Turning to time, place, and medium. I watched it in December 2014, shortly after Christmas. That's the time. I was at a mate's place in Frio, and we watched it in his makeshift theatre room. That's the place. And we watched the movie by streaming it, and that is the medium. And those are some specific features of the situational context of reception. Final main part of this lesson is looking at a past WACE exam question. Our past WACE exam question is, explain how at least one text manipulates the conventions of genres for a particular purpose and context. 2017 WACE exam, section 2, question 4. Our sample text is La La Land, directed by Damien Chazelle, came out in 2016. This is also one of my favorite movies of all time. The soundtrack is awesome. This movie takes you on one hell of an emotional roller coaster. And the ending is quite beautiful. It's bittersweet, but I think there's a really nice meaning behind it. Anyway, the link to the trailer for this movie is in the resources tab below the video. Go give it a watch, check it out, come back once you're done. Not a bad trailer, huh? Approaching the question. Firstly, what are the main parts of the question? First main part is manipulates the conventions of genres. Answering this part of the question requires us to address 3 questions. Firstly, what genres does the text belong to that you wish to discuss? Secondly, what are the conventions of those genres? And thirdly, how are those conventions manipulated? The appearance of the word genres requires us to state what those genres are, and because it's in plural form, we need to address at least 2 genres. The word conventions means that we need to address what some conventions of those genres are, and the word manipulates requires us to address how those conventions are manipulated. The next main part of the question is a particular purpose and context. Answering this part of the question requires us to address 2 questions. Firstly, what is the particular purpose? And secondly, what is the particular context? Hopefully you can see how I have arrived at these 2 questions from this here. So those are the main parts of the question. How do we address those main parts? Returning to the manipulates the conventions of genres part. We said that there are 3 questions that we need to address in order to address this part of the question. And that first question was, what genres does the text belong to that you wish to discuss? La La Land is a musical, and it is also a romance. Next, what are the conventions of those genres? For a musical, the protagonists overcome conflict and achieve their goals. That is something that typically happens in a musical. For a romance, the 2 characters typically live happily ever after. The third question, how are those conventions manipulated? In that second question, we outlined what things typically happen in those genres of a musical and a romance. For this third question, we're discussing how those things that typically happen in those genres are manipulated in La La Land. They don't happen in the same way in La La Land. In the case of a musical, that convention is manipulated because, yes, the protagonists achieve their goals, but they do that at great cost. And for a romance, the convention of living happily ever after together is manipulated because in La La Land, the 2 characters live happily ever after, but not together. As an aside, also note the word how in the question. That is a throwback to the lesson on language features. When you see how in a comprehending or responding section question, it should be ringing alarm bells in your head saying, discuss language features. So in an essay, you'd state how conventions are manipulated. In this case, the 2 main characters live happily ever after, but not together, and which language features are used to achieve that effect. Returning to the second main part of the question, a particular purpose and context. The first question to address this part of the question is, what is the particular purpose? We could say, the particular purpose is to challenge the audience's perception of what it takes to make it as an artist. The second question is, what is the particular context? And the particular context I'm going to refer to is the context of production, which is the mid-2010s. Because the movie was released in 2016 and it would have been shot 2 years prior to that and then edited and all of the marketing and release. So it really was produced in the middle of that decade. Specifically, we could say the ubiquity of social media bombards users with images of success. However, those users are seldom or rarely shown the downside of that, the downside of such success. What I just mentioned is a socio-cultural feature of the context of culture. Considering all of that, a sample thesis for this question might sound like this. La La Land manipulates the conventions of the musical and romance genres for the particular purpose of challenging the audience's perception of what it takes to make it as an artist. Conventions of the genres are also manipulated for the particular context of production of the 2010s, which was characterized by socio-cultural features such as the advent of social media and the distorted notion of success that different versions thereof perpetuated. Notice how these two sentences address every main part of the question. Manipulates the conventions of genres, manipulates the conventions of musical genre, romance genre. I've stated what the particular purpose is. I've stated what the particular context is, and I've also specified what type of context that I'm going to discuss, the context of production. If a marker read this sample thesis, they would be very pleased because they would instantly see that all of the main parts of the question are being addressed in the right way. This is a great first impression to make. To finish off, a couple of context tips. First, you don't have to discuss each category and every feature of each category whenever you're answering a context question. The question will typically guide you down a path of which context to discuss. For example, in the past WACE exam question that we looked at, I only referred to the cultural context that's embedded in the context of production. Next tip, use context nomenclature as much as possible. Hopefully you'll recall from the lesson on genre that this word nomenclature just means terminology. And the relevant terminology we should be using is context of production, context of reception, context of culture, context of situation, geographical features, religious features, ideological features, political features, socio-cultural features, historical features, personal context, immediate events, time, place, and medium. Using those terms tells the marker that you understand this concept very well. For example, in the sample thesis we looked at, I wrote, conventions of the genres are also manipulated for the particular context of production of the 2010s, which was characterized by socio-cultural features. Notice how I used the terms context of production and socio-cultural features. Once again, it's vital that you use context nomenclature as much as possible because WACE markers like seeing that type of terminology used in the appropriate context. All right, I swear that's the last context pun. Let's do a simple summary. What did we learn in this lesson? Firstly, we looked at the definition of context, and our definition is the cultural and situational environment in which a text is created or responded to. An important key takeaway from this part was that context is not a feature or a technique such as rhetorical question or metaphor that text creators use. Then we looked at the two categories of context. Our first category is context of production and context of reception. Looking at context of production, we learned that context of production is creator focused, and our definition for it is quite simply the environment in which a text is created. We also saw that the purpose of a text is significantly influenced by the environment in which the text is created. Example, Alex Garland's purpose to encourage the audience to consider whether machines could become sentient was influenced by the state of technology in the early 10s environment. Turning to context of reception, we saw that that one is audience focused. Our definition, the environment in which a text is responded to. The interrelationship with purpose, we saw that the purpose of a text is significantly influenced by the environment in which the text is received. The purpose of you watching Ex Machina with your mate during summer holidays would probably be very different to the purpose for which you're watching Ex Machina in the school classroom. The environment in both situations is influencing the purpose for which you're watching the movie. Put differently, example, the purpose of analyzing how Ex Machina conforms to and challenges the conventions of the sci-fi genre was influenced by the environment of an English classroom. That was context of production and reception. Then we looked at context of culture and context of situation. Focusing on context of culture, our definition is the general features surrounding a text's production and reception. Those general features are geographic, religious, ideological, political, socio-cultural, and historical, or GRIPSH. Turning to context of situation, our definition is the specific features surrounding a text production and reception. Those specific features are personal context, immediate events, and time, place, and medium, or PIT. Comparing cultural context and situational context. Firstly, cultural context requires you to analyze a text with a satellite, which allows you to see the general features that influence the text's production and reception. On the other hand, situational context requires you to analyze the text with a microscope, which allows you to see the specific features that influence the text's production and reception. The key takeaway here is that cultural context influences situational context. For example, an ideological conflict between two countries influences the way in which a text creator who's born in one of those countries depicts said conflict. Next main section of the lesson was the interplay between the categories of context. In this part of the lesson, we looked at that diagram. It covers one page in the PDF study notes, and that is really your cheat sheet for context. The top of that diagram or flowchart asks you this question. Does the question ask for the text context or your context? If it's the text context, it means you need to focus on the context of production, which will then lead you down to cultural context, and embedded within cultural context is situational context. If the text asks for your context, that means you're looking at the context of reception, and a part of the context of reception is the cultural context. Embedded in that is the situational context. Our example that we looked at was the interview. There's that big table in the PDF study notes. Go check that out if you want to recap how all of these different elements interrelate. Then we looked at a past WACE exam question, and in that part of the lesson, we looked at some context tips. Our first tip was that you don't have to discuss each category and every feature of each category whenever you're answering a context question. The question will guide you as to which type or category of context you should be discussing. Our second context tip was that you should use context nomenclature, context terminology as much as possible. It tells the marker that you understand this concept. And we're done. Nice work on making it to the end of the lesson. Make sure you go and complete the activities for this lesson on context. It requires you to complete 2 text tables, one for each study text. And the table that we looked at for the interview is your guide for how you should complete both text tables. Good luck with that, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep it simple.